What's good, folks? This is SilentMode, maker, artist and LEGO enthusiasts. It's time to get started on the big rebuild for this year. It's a project where I take one of my old creations and redesign or rebuild it with new techniques and parts. 3 creations were shortlisted for this year's big rebuild, and it was put to a public vote at 4 different events last year. The winning creation was the MHI Patient Carrier. This was one of the first models I designed coming out of my dark age, and doesn't it show? I had to relearn to build and was new to using LEGO Digital Designer. The vehicle itself was part of a novel I was writing at the time, loosely based on experiences at university. The story was set in an alternate universe where popularity and social acceptance were everything, and mental health issues were highly stigmatized. To have or even be accused of having a mental health problem meant you were ostracized and outcast. The acronym MHI stands for Mental Health Institute. This vehicle was intended to safely and securely transport patients and staff members to and from these institutions. However, it became common and trendy to use these vehicles to damage reputations. Unpopular people were often accused of being mentally ill, leading to a public display of being loaded into the patient carrier. To make matters worse, some of these vehicles and mental health institutions were owned by universities and other private companies, some of which were in on the accusations. So you can imagine there were accused people who were never actually helped. The original design was based on the premise of the vehicle being damage-proof, that it could withstand almost anything thrown at it, from vandalism to hijacking. Regarding the shape, I guess the use of slopes and sharp edges was inspired by the potential manufacturing process. If you think about how one would go about designing a damage-proof vehicle, smooth curves and fancy details aren't the highest priority. It would be much more important to ensure everything is welded or fused together. Anyway, the vehicle was designed to host a single patient and 2 staff members. The patient is loaded into the back of the vehicle, containing a makeshift padded room to reduce the chances of injury. There's a step that doubles as a door brace, preventing the doors from opening during transport. Despite the massive stigma against mental health issues, the patient carrier was primarily designed to protect the patient. As well as the padded interior to prevent self-harm, it was insulated from external sounds and vibrations. The staff members enter the vehicle from the doors on either side, which are opened using pads. They were intended to be keypads, but could also be biometric scanners. These doors lead into the cockpit, and you'll see an emergency button on either side, used if anything goes wrong. The roof above the cockpit also opens so the staff members can escape if necessary. It actually works quite well. Finally, you'll notice that the patient carrier is much wider than most vehicles. It was designed when official LEGO vehicles were around 6 studs wide, and people still use those dedicated road plates. This vehicle would have taken up an entire road. If you consider the purpose of the vehicle to safely transport a patient and staff, it makes sense to have cleared roads. Thinking about how to recreate the patient carrier, there are definitely some features I'd like to preserve. I would keep the 2 staff members, preserving the basic minifigure heads to make them gender and race agnostic. I'm not sure whether I would keep the uniforms, as they're not necessarily medically trained. I would look to preserve the extended mudguards as a distinctive feature and for protecting the wheels. The tinted windscreen makes sense, not only to protect the identity of the staff members, but to give the impression of bulletproof or damage-proof glass. I would keep the side access doors for the staff members, and though I like the use of the transparent tile for the door access, I'm torn between using that or a printed keypad tile. Lastly, it makes sense to preserve the roof access, both to easily place figures inside the cockpit and so they can escape. Without a doubt, the first thing to improve is the stability of these wheels. They're easily lost when they fall off. Of course, this would be a factor when designing the vehicle's base. I'd also like to introduce curves instead of having these sharp slopes all over, to give the vehicle a more feminine instead of an industrial look, which would actually go with the backstory. I also noticed that for some reason there are no manual controls inside the cockpit. You could say this is a driverless, remote-controlled vehicle, but that leaves it open to getting hacked. So let's add some manual controls, perhaps a steering wheel. It would also make sense to have roof access for the patient area to make it easier to place the patient inside. It's manageable, but I have to use finger trickery and it's not easy. Speaking of roof access, I personally would prefer to use smooth hinges instead of those stepped ones. The stepped hinges work for the step into the back, but otherwise they're annoying. Finally, I think it's best to remove this internal shutter intended to let the staff keep tabs on the patient. In the interest of security, we can have them monitor the patient with a hidden camera. I would like to add basic wheel suspension to give the vehicle an added dimension, although Technic is out of my depth. I'll have to experiment. Another consideration is the use of colour. I generally design things in black and white, and personally I think the existing colour scheme is okay. It might be interesting to introduce other colours or perhaps decals to add variety and represent company branding. Since AI or artificial intelligence is all the rage these days, I consulted ChatGPT for guidelines. One point it raised was the need for ventilation and temperature control inside the vehicle. We could add a simple air vent in both compartments. Another point was the inclusion of emergency equipment and tools, which is obvious but easily missed. We should definitely have a first aid kit and a communications device, but we might also want weapons for self-defense. I also used DALL-E to generate a technical drawing of a secure patient carrier. The output resembled a civilian people carrier, and I was intrigued by the sloping front of the vehicle. I don't know whether to go for this or keep the vertical windscreen of the original design. The drawing also raised the idea of having a dedicated seat to strap the patient in. It makes sense for those who have to be restrained, but I think the chair, if one is included, should be optional. Because everything is also about so-called inclusivity, an important thing missed in the original design is an accessible ramp for anyone unable to use the step. To be really fancy, I could have it fold or slide underneath the vehicle. This rebuild poses a challenge because I've never been good at designing vehicles. I like them, but I've never had that level of interest. Of course, that hasn't stopped me making some, and I don't think they've been that bad. As is typical with the woke ideology, mental health issues are rarely acknowledged or recognized within the LEGO space. Although the hobby is widely advertised as improving one's mental health, I've seen firsthand that many of your favorite personalities within the LEGO space see it as a joke. I'm interested to see how the new version of the patient carrier turns out. More importantly, it's an opportunity to raise awareness of the real-world stigma surrounding mental health. I hope I can do this rebuild justice.